Welcome to We Are Human Leaders. When you're here with us, you're part of the global movement driving change. Each conversation is an invitation to grow, to question, and to co-create a future where people and business flourish together. And we, myself, Alexis, and my co-host, Sally Clark, are here to be your guides on this journey, connecting you to big ideas, bold conversations, and brave questions that will help you lead more human every day. Today's conversation is with Rachel Voysey, who is a registered psychologist and founding director of the Relationship Room in Sydney. Specifically, Rachel specializes in relationships such as communication breakdowns, relationship crises, and also infidelity, which is very much what we look at diving into in our conversation today. Now, Sally, this is a really fun, but a very interesting and deep conversation as well with Rachel. I'd love to know from you, what were some of the biggest lessons that you learned from the chat today?
Yeah, thanks, Lex. I think it's one of the most personal conversations we've had on the podcast so far. And I think that was really refreshing in a lot of ways for me. My real takeaway was just how clearly Rachel reminded us of the human in these situations,
Totally.
whether it's infidelity at work, whether it's a romantic relationship at work, whether it's a friendship you're navigating in the context of work. We're all humans. And even when it looks scandalous or it looks like a bad decision from the outside, we really need to keep coming back to our empathy, our compassion, and good judgment around these situations, whether we're leaders or whether we're the person actually in the relationship. How about you? What stood out for you?
Yeah, I think even outside the infidelity side of things, just the fact that workplace relationships are so common. And in fact, we shouldn't be necessarily labeling them as good or bad or avoid that they're part of what it means to be a human being. So I really loved looking at the romantic relationship side of things with Rachel, and also some of the challenges we can face with forming bonds and friendships with colleagues in the workplace as well. I felt like there was a lot of practical wisdom in the conversation and insight that will help, you and I in our working relationship moving forward, but also that I'm sure our listeners will get out of it as well. So this conversation is all about relationships in the workplace with psychologist Rachel Voysey. It is such a fun conversation. Let's dive in.
Welcome to We Are Human Leaders, Rachel. It's really wonderful to have you with us today. We'd love to get started by maybe a bit of a confronting question, but we're going to talk today about, romantic relationships in the workplace. Are these good? Are these bad? Are these an absolute no-go? There's something that both Lex and I have our own personal experiences with. So we'd love to hear from you as a relationship psychologist. What's your advice?
I just think they happen. I'm like, whether they're good, bad, ugly, or whatever, I just think the reality is they happen, right? Like, you can't deny it. They do. And all the time, and always have, and always will. So I'm like, I'm used to confronting questions. My whole world is living behind a therapy door, often where only reality lives most of the time, or a lot more reality than you get when the door opens. Yeah. So the confronting doesn't bother me too much, but I just kind of think you've got to deal with what's real and what's happening. Because that's what most people need. So I just think they happen. And because they happen so much, we need to talk about them, and we need to have ways to deal with them. And there's different kinds too. Like, there's times where people just meet at work and, that's cool and it goes well. There's obviously tricky relationships. There's cases where they're much more complex, and maybe there's infidelity or big power differential. So it's hard to give like one category of answer when I'm talking about this. And I often say that to people because there are all kinds of different relationships that go on. And I suppose that's what defines the nature of what I end up talking about with people.
Such an important point to really underscore that there's no sort of black or white here. And I think it is something, it's like so much of human experience. I think if we deny it, then we're really doing ourselves a disservice, because it's, we have to acknowledge that these situations are coming about. We spend most of our time, our waking hours at work. So it seems quite natural in a lot of ways that we would then connect with people there. Speaking for myself, my longest relationship started with a colleague I was working at a Japanese company in the Netherlands at the time. And we were lucky in the sense that we had that same sort of level that we were starting at. So there wasn't that power dynamic. But we did have to go through the process of, do we talk to HR? How do we go through that? So I'm sure we'll unpack in this conversation sort of what parameters might be helpful. But I'm also going to throw to Lex, because you've had an experience with this too.
I have, yeah. So my current long-term partner who I've been together with over 7 years now, we actually both met working together as well. And an interesting, perhaps, question for you here, Rachel, is we met, you mentioned earlier this idea of power dynamics. So we met in quite an interesting circumstance where I was brought into the company to then um, effectively manage him in certain capacities, which is an interesting one. And it was, um, we sort of navigated that best we could at the time, where we were then separating that working relationship before we sort of entered into a romantic relationship. But can you help maybe unpack this a little bit more for us here? Because very often we find that maybe it's not colleagues on perhaps the same
Mm.
level if it were in an organization that we're entering a relationship with. Do you have any advice for navigating that power dynamic so things don't get perhaps messy in that on that side of things?
Yeah, and you're right. It often isn't because it's there's so many
Mm,
tiers of
totally.
not just power dynamics, but I suppose influence and management.
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
it's probably when we really think about it, pretty unusual that you're going to get someone exactly on the same kind of path as you. So I think that's again very common, very realistic. But I mean, something you said is that you really sounds like you thought about it, and I think that's the thing, right? I think we can't pretend that relationships when they're at work are just personal, like they do affect the organization. So I think we have to kind of acknowledge
Mm,
that like we know it's personal and it's our world, but when it sits within a workplace too, it can't just be personal. So I think just being really intentional and
yeah.
thoughtful about like, how's this going to affect us? How's it going to affect the people around us? Are we acting in our ethics? Because again, HR is not there to like police your personal life. They're just there to protect the organization, right? To make
Mm,
sure that everything's going as well as it can for everybody, that in its best form. That's what HR should be. Not always, but mostly that's kind of the intention. So, like again, I think if you think about it and you talk about it from that kind of perspective, and it sounds like you did that as a couple, then I think you can navigate it really well, and it can be like actually really positive for performance and outcomes. Actually, sometimes too.
Can we delve into that a little bit more deeply, Rachel, in terms of the impact on organizations? And so perhaps for a leader listening now, perhaps they may not have this situation going on right now, but it comes up often. So what would you sort of suggest in terms of understanding what kind of implications it can have for culture, for team dynamics, and that kind of flow on effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the most important thing when you're just trying to understand it as a leader is that it will affect, because it will affect things. The number one thing I say to people is their transparency and honesty around it. Like as long as there's not kind of like secrets and gossip, and if that kind of thing's taking hold around a relationship, that might be something where as a leader you want to have some conversations, not just with the people in the relationship, but just about trying to keep like fairness and kind of all the good things we want to bring into a workplace around trust and those kind of things that help promote the culture around that relationship, right? So I think the last thing, I think we know it's pretty obvious when something's turning a little bit icky and people were talking about it secretly,
mm.
or there's maybe perceived favoritism or any of those things, or little divisions are forming, people get on their side. We know when that's happening, I think, as leaders. So we have to just be, I think, be well, the thing I guess I talk about mostly in mental health is don't avoid the problem, it'll make it bigger. Just go and have a conversation.
Mm.
It's probably the first thing to do.
What is so interesting about what you've said, Rachel, is in my experience, I felt like almost this tension of wearing two different hats. There was me in a newly formed relationship, trying to navigate, a new relationship and what that means for me as a person, what that means for us in a couple. But then there was me in a management capacity in an organization having to think about, well, at what point, do I put a formal announcement out? Like, how does it's quite awkward, like, and because you're also navigating a new relationship, you don't a lot of the time want to put too much pressure on a fresh relationship until you've really had the opportunity to discover for yourselves what that looks like as well. So I really felt this real tension around, well, what does transparency look like? What is the right moment to have the conversations with my team? Those above me, also my team members. So there aren't issues like gossip and sort of, perceived favoritism and those sorts of things you've mentioned. And I honestly, I don't know if I did it very well, but I found it to be one of the biggest challenges of my career so far.
I completely understand that. And I would say you're not alone there. And so many of the people I've worked with, because there isn't any support or conversation about how you do this.
Mm.
And I always say, what's the difference between secrecy and privacy, right? That's a big conversation I have with people all the time, right? I think you're exactly like, and as you said, you're trying to work out, are we a thing before you go into all these other people are a thing. Like that's big.
The hard
crazy,
launch being immediately your,
Totally. I was like, do I hard launch with an email to the team? Like, this is so weird.
And then when
subject line.
one, you just don't know how it's, And that's where I think too professionalism comes in. Like if you can keep the boundaries of the relationship fairly separate to work, and of course, you can't, sneak around with, just like people might see you around and out. But generally, I think if you're being professional at work and there's boundaries there, and in the beginning of a relationship when you're taking it slow, there normally are, then I don't think there's any need for it to cross over or any need to think, oh, am I being secretive about this? No, you're just protecting your privacy and that early development of a relationship. And I don't think there's any need to share that kind of thing too early.
Can we just double click on that a little bit further, Rachel? Something you mentioned there, this idea of boundaries. And that was something where, perhaps in different relationships in the past, if my partner had been outside of the organization, if maybe he'd met me for lunch at work or visited my workplace, I wasn't afraid to be affectionate. But obviously then when you're working in a workplace with your partner, I almost felt like I needed to pull further away and look even more detached from that, especially in the early stages. What are some of the sort of behaviors that are a no-go in the workplace when it comes to relationships? Like, can you help us unpack that? Because I know it's obviously something we want to be conscious of to not make other people uncomfortable as well. So what are some of those boundaries?
I mean, I think probably physical intimacy is one of them because, again, it's just not something we do at work and it can make other people uncomfortable. And I think anything as well that can feel more like obviously you've got an intimate relationship. Intimate relationships are defined by the fact that you know more about each other than other people know about you. At work, you don't want to feel like there's some kind of collusion where you guys are working on working together and kind of having this pushing other people away from your special relationship. That can feel less like intimacy and more like kind of threatening and some kind of in group or collusion. So I think just those things around trying to stay really inclusive, not do too much, or preferably very much limiting anything physically affectionate. And then I think everything else should be fine.
Awesome explanation for us, Rachel. And I'd love to sort of pivot now to a different kind of relationship that we do often also see in the workplace. I certainly saw it when I was a lawyer in a very large firm, incidences of infidelity. And it's a topic that has very much hit the headlines in recent weeks at a very sort of prominent sort of scale at senior leadership. Can you talk to us a bit about infidelity in the workplace? So that's two people who are in separate relationships cheating with a colleague.
Yes.
Why do we see this happening, and what sort of, how would you describe the phenomenon?
So I kind of specialize in infidelity both privately and also within organizations because it is such a sensitive and complex area. And as we saw with the very public incident, people have this massive transference of feelings onto it, right? So as soon as that kind of relationship is there, you almost have to expect that there's going to be a lot of strong feelings around it. And my thinking on it, and then a lot of the work I do crosses inside and outside the workplace because we are all humans and we go in and out the work and we want to be professional, but we are at our core still the human in the workplace. Infidelity happens for lots of different reasons, right? You can never put it into one category. I've worked with so many people over the years that have told me they never thought they'd be in the position of having an affair. Like it was high up on their values and integrity that was something, or they'd experienced it secondhand as a child or as a partner. And so they really had strong values and yet somehow they end up in these situations. So I think a lot of the moralizing that goes around it, though, never kind of takes that into account. We take the humanity out of it a lot, like quite a lot. And I think particularly in these public events on social media, the humanity completely goes. It becomes like kind of a bit of a stone throwing spectacle. And we forget that these are often people in really difficult situations on multiple levels, especially when it's at work. So, yes, affairs can happen. I think the thing that happens at work is you can feel like work is a different world. There can be this real
Yeah.
escapism. And I think a lot of people have affairs for escapism. You know, life is stressful, life is hard. Sometimes we don't like ourselves very much. And a lot of what happens in affairs and relationships is we see ourselves through other people's eyes, right? So if I don't really feel very good about myself, and maybe my partner and I at home are having a really difficult time, but at work I have this different persona and somebody really likes me, maybe I really need that. So in an unhealthy way, I probably should be in therapy, but maybe I'm not. Or, you know, I'm looking for that validation. So I think sometimes this work world just feels like a separate world where you can be seen differently, you interact differently, you can escape. And that can be one of the reasons that workplace infidelity occurs. I think there's a lot of what we would probably call some kind of trauma bonding that happens at work. Like we go through high
Yep.
stresses together, big lows, high highs. And often also there's other things outside of work like social events, conferences, travel, alcohol, late hours that also create further bonding between people. So really is kind of a hotbed of risk factors that if you can fall into an affair. And the classic reason most people think it happens is because of desire. People think, oh, but you must be in an affair because you just really fancied that person or there was sexual desire. And yeah, that's true. But I actually think that sometimes that's not the biggest reason. I think it's much more about escape or emotional validation or some kind of loneliness or unmet needs outside the workplace. But there's this place where you feel life is separate. And then, you know, often too, it starts slowly, right? Like you're having a bit of a whinge or making a bit of a joke and suddenly you're telling a bit more to someone there that you would not normally confide in. And the next thing you're in a vulnerable conversation. So it's a slippery slope with workplace infidelity, but there are just so many factors that make it such a high risk area.
That's a really interesting point, Rachel. And sort of something that resonated for me as you were speaking there is I've often felt that my colleagues understand my experience of the workplace and sort of see that side of me, which really does feel like a way to feel validated. Like my career has always been a big sense of achievement for me. It's something I'm really proud of. And it's something that unless you're kind of in the trenches, in the team, so to speak, you don't really see what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. So I've always felt, you know, I've had colleagues that I've loved working with. We've really had that sort of camaraderie and that bond. And so I feel like I can understand a little bit how people might feel seen in the workplace in a way that they don't get anywhere else in their life.
Yes.
And I think what I related to as well, Rachel, was the trauma bonding aspect of it, having worked at a very big, intense law firm and very sort of really busy environment. And you sort of get this real sense that no one who's outside of that world really genuinely understands the pressures that you're under and the high levels that you're being held to account. And so you really have this sense that it does go, I think, far beyond sort of just pure physical attraction to this sense of you really get me. And as Lex mentioned, in a way, potentially that my partner at home doesn't because they're not exposed to these situations. And I think I've seen it a lot. There's quite a lot of, lawyers often do tend to date lawyers. And I wonder if this is part of it as well, because there's that sort of understanding of that going on. For someone, for a leader perhaps who's sort of in this environment, perhaps an HR leader who's thinking, about when this kind of thing comes up, what would you advise them in terms of responding to this becoming known within a team, within an organization? How do you navigate that?
Yeah. I think this is, again, one of those areas where often it probably hasn't been disclosed to you. You're hearing it through other people reporting it, or you're seeing it in disruption in the team or division. So I think a lot of the time the leaders I work with say, I need to approach this. They are the ones who have to make the approach. And of course, because there is a lot of shame and guilt and also a lot at stake because of these people have other relationships so that, they're potentially going to lose their personal life, affect their professional life. So there's going to be a lot of defensiveness. So I think, as I said, it's, we're there to help protect the organization and the people in it. So trying to make that approach in a really non-judgmental, non-punitive, like I'm just here to help understand this. I can sense something's going on. Can we just try and unpack it? And with absolute discretion and confidentiality, which is super important. I think if people feel that's possible, often they are looking for a line of help. And it's probably where I get called in sometimes, because in these situations, it's kind of how I sidestepped both to a little bit of kind of corporate as well as personal work is it was often way out of the depth of the services normally available with EAPs or support services, because it is such a complex area. So I think the first step as a leader is to get the conversation happening, try to get some trust from the people who are in that affair so that you can start steps to maybe give them support together. Also looking at potentially how you can keep them safe if there is a power dynamic, like can you do some restructuring so that the crossover isn't so much there in ways that might, negatively affect the business, especially if there's lines of reporting or lines of power that might actually end up being quite difficult for other people and could look at favoritism or there can be much bigger consequences too. So I think really trying to help to reduce the risk of the situation, but it all starts with a conversation, and you're really relying on one or both of them opening up, and it's so hard.
Rachel, you mentioned this idea earlier of secrecy and privacy being sort of interconnected concepts, if you will. When it comes to infidelity and a workplace relationship of infidelity, where do we step in though? At what point is it our business as a leader? Like, is there a line when it starts impacting the team, or is it as soon as we notice, presumably, hopefully before everything hits the fan? Where do we actually step in?
I think if it's either affecting the team or you really see some massive conflicts of interest, and there could be further disciplinary action that occurred, like, trying to protect the business as well as the team, which are not always the same. So I think it's if you feel that there's effects on the team and it's causing division, or, even just call it, gossip will trump performance. When there's a lot of gossip, people are they're not performing as well. So I think those kind of things are where it's either that or you really see a risk to the business because there are maybe some serious ethical, things going on that could affect outcomes for the business where there's going to be repercussions later. I think they're the only two reasons to really step in. If it's not affecting anyone, then it's really not necessarily, you're not there, as I said, to police someone's personal life. So it's fine otherwise. Yeah.
I can imagine it's a difficult one to navigate in some ways because it is like as you're saying, we often think of sort of work and private as being these sort of siloed components of ourselves, but we bring our hearts to work. And obviously, these, I don't know if there's any data, but I'm sure the incidence of relationships at work is high.
Huge,
so I think what sort of circling back to what you opened with, this kind of sense of just really acknowledging, being honest with ourselves. So whether we're the person in the relationship, understanding that this is different to had I just met someone who's working for a different organization and we have that sort of separate lives. And then also for leaders to understand that then, inherently at some point in your career, you're probably going to work with someone who's going to enter into a relationship around you, and to not shove that under the carpet, not ignore it, also not pry, and to sort of navigate that line in a way that is both, in the interest in the organization and the ongoing relationships that you have with these people as well. It's some complexity to navigate. It's human relationships, which I guess are inherently complex. As a relationship psychologist, what would you advise someone who's perhaps met someone at work and is pretty blown away? How would you sort of navigate those early days, the first steps in that sort of fledgling relationship?
Yeah, I think you should just enjoy it, as you should when you meet someone you really like. I mean, often people do meet someone they really, really like, and it sounds like, happened to you guys, where it actually becomes a really great relationship and it's fantastic. So I think,
totally.
Initially you should just be able to enjoy it like you enjoy other relationships, but keeping it mostly outside of work. And I think, again, like it might have to expedite a couple of discussions of at least both naming that we are having this relationship within some degree of workplace. How do we both feel about that? And having a really good conversation about the impacts for both, And then I really think outside of that, once you've assessed the risk factors and you kind of, you're both okay with that, you let it progress back to that point we talked about before, where either it starts to be something that you feel is really serious and you don't want to keep it separate from work.
Yeah.
And at that point, I suppose you think about who you want to tell and how you want to tell them. And at certain levels too, it doesn't have to be a big announcement to HR. It could just, sometimes it's very natural that it finds out when there's no secrecy. HR don't often have to get involved. Such and such a relationship, it's good, seems healthy, doesn't seem to be crossing any work boundaries.
Yeah.
It goes on from there. And then I suppose the only thing is sometimes when relationships end, it can be tricky. And that's another thing I think you probably should talk about a bit earlier, is if this doesn't go well, how do we manage it? And sometimes people, or if it gets really, really serious, some people also talk about whether they both want to stay in the same workplace, because that could
Totally.
also affect your relationship. You want to protect your relationship, right? And working
And your
together
career.
and your career, exactly. And sometimes you actually make a really, intentional, informed decision that one of both of you wants to go work somewhere else.
Yeah. That was certainly the case in my relationship. We'd worked together about a year before we made the decision that the dynamic just wasn't the right fit for us, especially having so much overlapping responsibility. I felt like when we got home, we were still talking about work all of the time. And so it just felt like a never ending cycle of going to work, dealing with work things at work, my partner being involved in that, coming home from work and sort of continuing to talk about work. And in my case, it sort of became a toxic thing because there was just no break from work. It just felt like work had infiltrated all parts of my life. So it wasn't necessarily that my partner and I couldn't work well together. It's just that work just became everything because we had, it was like it's like when you have all the same hobbies together, all the same friends together, you kind of run out of things to talk about after a while.
Totally. Yes, you want to bring some fresh energy home sometimes.
Yeah.
We bring a bit of fresh material back at the end of the day.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Rachel, I do just want to make a slight sidestep, if I may, into what I think is another really important relationship in the workplace. And certainly it seems that we see from the data that the idea of a workplace bestie or, a BFF, as our millennials will call it, can be actually really, really beneficial to our experience of work. In fact, the data seems to suggest that it helps us stay more engaged in our workplaces and sort of increases our overall satisfaction of work. One such experience I have had, however, is the falling out of a friendship who also happened to be a colleague, which in my experience became really, really challenging to navigate in the workplace. I just wonder, could you shine a little bit of a light on that side of things for us? Friendships in the workplace, how might we navigate that and perhaps the breakdown of a friendship when
Yeah.
we're also colleagues?
It's interesting you ask that, because I actually, very weird thing that people don't ever think people do is I actually also have done a lot of therapy with friends, which is funny. Couples come and families, but I've actually
Love
done a
that.
lot of work with friends because of friendship breakdowns.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, it's one of these areas where trying to unpack why it broke down can be really difficult. Like a lot of friendships, friendship in the workplace, friendship anywhere is good because connection is so key to our mental health. And everyone knows that now. It's up there with sleep and exercise and eating well. It probably trumps them, actually. Like if you feel connected and supported and there's, those few shiny moments where you grab a coffee together in the day or you smile, like that will do just wonders for your workplace performance and your morale going in. But yes, on the flip side, I suppose when things break down, the thing I see in most friendship breakdowns is huge amounts of misunderstanding. Like normally they start from something happens, you don't know what you've done, you rack your brain trying to work out what you've done or what's being said, mostly don't work it out. Get a lot of rejection. Like normally someone will avoid you, like, you want to have a coffee? No. And then by the next thing, like, I actually don't want to be friends with me anymore. So then you experience the rejection, which is awful because you start grieving the friendship. And then eventually, like you said, you kind of just drift completely apart. Or there can be a bit of like toxic kind of aftermath if other people in the workplace are getting involved on either side, right? And so, I guess, as boring as it's going to sound, because it sounds like the number one thing you'd hear from anyone in my job, but it's like, again, I think you need to proactively talk about those things, and the earlier the better. Like if you're feeling signs that something is wrong, most people mutually avoid it. Like I've had people who've come in 10 years later because they've recontacted a friend and gone, why did we stop talking? And the reason that they'll find out is something they'd never thought of.
Right. Well,
tiny. 10 years later, it doesn't feel tiny because of friendship. But at the time, you're like, why wouldn't you have just gone to them and said, hey, I'm struggling with this? And often they're around sensitive emotions, like maybe feeling a little bit inadequate, or there could be jealousy, or things that are really hard to say to someone, or feeling a little bit rejected. But I just think when you see any relationship, when your intuition tells you something's wrong, it probably is. Like we have very sophisticated pattern recognition, which we call intuition, and it is the most powerful form of intelligence. And when you feel something's off, back yourself and start a conversation. And you will most likely, maybe not save the friendship, you may very well save the friendship, but you'll certainly avoid that toxic, yucky breakdown bit that then affects you. It's the opposite. You just don't want to go to work.
I think that's such a powerful message for all of us, Rachel, that sort of reminder that we make so many assumptions. We build all these narratives in our heads about what's going on. And what you speaking through there also sort of reminded me a little bit of kind of high school dynamics of kind of people then taking sides and it becoming gossipy and it become really devolving to a really unfortunate sort of level of human interaction.
Yeah.
So any steps that we can proactively take. And I know I've had a couple of friendship breakups in my life where I've really tried to kind of bring that conversation in a way that it was really trying genuinely to retain the friendship, but navigate that challenge that we were experiencing. And a couple of times it hasn't worked. And so there's been this kind of,
No closure.
and yeah, exactly. And I do, at the same time, I do really feel grateful to myself that I'm still, always learning to communicate better, but that I had the confidence and the trust in the relationship to actually address this issue that I was experiencing, rather than just sort of letting it go on and leading to resentment and leading to ghosting each other.
Absolutely. And it comes back to, everyone understands attachment styles when it comes to relationships. It comes back to the same thing in any human connection where we perceive possible rejection, right? So I always talk about attachment styles as it's like a movement, right? Like when you're secure, you can kind of hold your position. When you're anxious, you kind of lean in and get all scared and like want to really like pursue what's going on. When you're avoidant, you kind of lean back and go, I think I don't really need this anyway. And the interesting thing I like to say about often define secure attachment is the ability to pursue connection but mitigate and tolerate rejection. So when you go to have that conversation and go, hey, like, is something wrong? The thing that puts most of us off it is we feel we're going to get rejected. And sometimes we do. Like you said, sometimes people go, no, I'm good. And you're like, oh, you're so not. And please tell me. But they don't tell you. But I think if you can just think, okay, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Yes, you might get rejected. You may not find out, but at least you tried. If you can hold that thing of, I'm going to take that risk, and rejection makes us feel like we're going to die. So we avoid it at all costs. It's really primitive psychology stuff, and it comes into things all the time, and it makes us act very irrationally to things that should seem very small. So I think just being like really seeing it for what it is and be like, I'm going to pursue this. I might get rejected, but at least I've tried. I've really tried to be self-aware enough to do the best thing here. And if it doesn't work out, well, okay, it doesn't work out. Maybe, I think most women have had a friendship where you never quite know what happened. And it always kind of messes with your head a bit.
Totally. And it's so interesting because I do feel like rejection in my life is one of the most horrific feelings. I hate it. But Sally, if you don't mind, let's talk about us, because this was a really interesting situation. Sally and I were in, Rachel, where we actually met doing consultancy work online. So we started in a professional capacity. We've since, over the last 5 years, become, really dear friends to one another. Something that I always find really challenging, not just with Sally, but for me generally, is the spillover of addressing any workplace or consultancy conflict Sally and I might have, and separating that from her, my friend. Because there are times where, I'll be frustrated at Sal for something that's happened at work. Like that happens with every person in every organization. And I find my mind making little stories like Sally doesn't understand how hard I work, or Sally doesn't appreciate my value, or Sally doesn't, love me as much as I love her. And then suddenly I'm, off to the races and the narrative has got so out of control. What would be your advice for someone who's potentially having a conflict with a friend in the workplace to kind of stop that from spilling over?
Yeah, I think you just need to, like, if the conflict's in the workplace, I think you just need to also really take a little bit of a minute to yourself to unpack what is happening for you in it. Because what happens with most conflicts is we have our story in our head that which we're very often wrong on. Like, you got your narrative, and even if you do address it, you go and address it. Even if you're addressing it in your head, you're kind of addressessing it in this kind of like attacking way.
Totally.
Like, you're doing this
and in a cyclical way.
like you're doing this thing and it's not right, and like you said, like, you don't get me, and again, couples, friends, all communication will tell you that's never going to get you anywhere. So I say check in with yourself and really ask yourself, like, what is it that you really need that you're not getting, or what is it that's really hurting you? And maybe that's something you could even just identifying that helps you soothe yourself a bit. And self-soothing's awesome. Maybe you go, you know what, this is actually about that, and when I look at it that way, I think I can kind of be okay with it. And if you're really not, go to the other person, but don't go, as we so often do when we're hurt, on the attack. Like, go and just say, hey, this is what's happening and this is what I think I need and this is how I feel and I just want you to understand. And most people will be very receptive to that. And as much as it sounds like, I've said people, it sounds like active listening. Yeah, but it's active listening when you care is so hard, because again, you think, oh my God, they're like, if they don't get me, I'm going to feel so hurt. But if you say it that way, people hear you. That's often the thing that's needed, rather than going on this defensive kind of attacking kind of thing, just say it well. Just tell the person how you feel, what you need. Most people hear it and you move on. Or sort it out with yourself maybe. Self-regulation is a big thing, but you need to go the next layer of what do I really need that's not happening with Sal or whatever. Yeah.
I love those two layers that you've elucidated there, Rachel, because I think they're so important, that kind of really checking in with self, which is definitely for me. And I echo what Lex has said. She's an incredible friend. I love our working relationship. I love our friendship. And there's occasionally times where I project my own narrative onto whatever's going on in our workplace. And I think I'm actually getting better at sort of catching myself in that and going, no, like, just stop the story, like her right there. So having that kind of understanding of self-awareness and also then self-regulation in that moment, but then also having the courage, I think, to have a call. I think for us it's worked really well, where if there is something that we're perhaps, because we do a lot asynchronously, and that's these flat words on the page, and sometimes it's like if we misinterpret them or we take it out of context, it's so great to have that cut through of just having a call and immediately rehumanizing each other and sort of reconnecting in our working and our friendship relationship, that really I think has helped us, particularly since we've started working in the same time zone again as well.
Well, there's a real thing now, right, called Slack rage, and if you hit me with the wrong emojis, you can really trigger me. So it's pretty funny because sometimes what Sally puts in Trello, I'll be like, what the hell does she mean by that? And then I'll call her and she's like, oh, hey, I just wondered if this was the case. And I was like, all right, I definitely let myself run really deeply down the hole there.
Absolutely. And especially if things feel unequal. One of the things I'd always say to people to remember is there's a very central principle of all relationships that the give and take has to be equal on average over time.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be equal even within a month or maybe 6 months. Maybe someone's going through, but over time, both business, intimate, friendship, and this is actually when you strip down most of the people that have ever come in for friendship therapy, ultimately there's been a breakdown in the perception of give and take. Someone feels used or they feel like someone's taking more than they give. And in business, this is big, right?
Sure.
Maybe you feel someone's not getting you, so therefore they're actually overburdening you, or they're underperforming, but you don't know how to say that because they're also your friend. Those kind of things. I think if you just go, okay, are we equal in our give and take? Is there a discrepancy here? That can help you identify, I think 90% of what often is bothering you in a relationship.
Such a fantastic insight, Rachel. I think we could talk to you all day about our I don't think we need therapy, Lex. I think we're pretty good. But
second guessing my choice to not be in therapy right now, to be honest.
But incredibly helpful insights you've given us, Rachel. And I think the attachment style stuff is really interesting in the context of the workplace as well. Are there any sort of, when we think about romantic relationships at work in particular, any final thoughts that you want to sort of leave our listeners with in terms of understanding how to navigate this, or perhaps a myth that really needs to be busted?
I just think from the outside looking in, when we're around workplace relationships, you just want to be super mindful and compassionate for these people that they're in their most important thing, their relationship, is also tied up with maybe their other most important thing, their work. And we need to be mindful of that and compassionate about it rather than gossipy and judgy. It's not a soap opera happening at work. It's two people with massive stuff on the line trying to navigate it. And when it comes to obviously the more, I suppose, that the infidelity, the more scandalous ones, that actually dials up, not down, right? It's like two people in a highly complex situation. Yes, we can, there might be lots of reasons that, that happened, but ultimately, both as leaders, trying to just remember that, we need to support and humanize relationships in the workplace, not just treat it like we're ticking boxes on a, conduct and risk assessment, which is often what gets done. But at the end of the day, it's people, and they're going to be going through a lot. Offering them support and compassion and protecting our organizations is really a really important thing to do.
Rachel, I think that's a very helpful insight, and it reminds me of this idea that we don't want ourselves to be judged by our worst moment. And so I think we need to give others that grace as well. While we may not agree or respect their decisions that they've made, we don't fully understand the context either. Don't. And I think that is really where, as leaders, we can step up with grace and show that compassion, as you've mentioned, to everyone. So thank you so much for being with us on We Are Human Leaders, Rachel. This has been so much fun.
Thanks, guys. And I love talking to you. I'd love to just stay and keep talking as well. It's been great talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thanks for joining us for another amazing episode of We Are Human Leaders. It's been a delight to have you with us. If you'd like to learn more about the show, you can delve into the show notes, get all the links. And if you'd like to learn more about the We Are Human Leaders movement around the globe, you can find us at www.wearehumanleaders.com. As human leaders, we're seeking to create better workplaces, to lead better, to live truer, and to be the change that we want to see in the world. We are all human first and leaders second. Thanks so much for being a part of this incredible movement. We'll see you next time.